Nayomi had never felt a gentle hand without pain. The beautiful Kavangan leopard had only ever known cruelty. Her world was one of steel cages, biting ropes, and the endless shadows of poachers. For years, she was little more than a prisoner, her wild spirit crushed under the weight of human brutality. When rescuers finally uncovered the makeshift poaching camp deep into dry woodlands, they found her curled into the farthest corner of a rusted cage. Her golden coat, dappled with deep black rosettes, was dulled with grime. But what shattered them wasn't her appearance. It was the way her body shook, violently, ceaselessly, as if the fear had burrowed into her bones. Nobody could get close. Every step toward her sent Nayomi into a frenzy of growls and quaking, her eyes squeezed shut as though willing herself invisible. She didn't just fear humans. She had given up on them entirely. But then Leona Hayes walked into Sundown Haven Sanctuary, thinking it was just another morning shift. The air was sharp with the scent of dew as she parked beneath the eucalyptus trees. Sunlight trickled through the branches like soft gold fingers, dappling the gravel lot in shifting light. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, shrill and fleeting, reminding Leona that the world beyond the sanctuary's fences was alive and unbroken. As she stepped through the gates of the facility, nothing seemed out of place, until she caught sight of Dr. Callum Rhodes, the sanctuary's director. His usually steady gaze was tight with concern. Without a word, he motioned for her to follow. Down a long, echoing hallway lined with soft animal cries, chirps, low grumbles, distant howls, they reached the most secluded wing of the sanctuary, one reserved for the most damaged rescues. Animals whose wounds weren't always visible. Animals like Nayomi. There, in a cage far darker than the rest, Leona saw her. A magnificent female leopard, her frame still muscular despite clear neglect. She was huddled so tightly against the wall it looked like she was trying to disappear into it. Her eyes wouldn't lift, her ears pinned flat. Every inch of her was recoiled from the world. Leona's chest tightened. This wasn't just a scared animal. This was a soul broken clean through. She's from that poacher den up in the northern ridgeline, Callum explained, voice hushed. They kept her caged for years. No record of when she last touched grass. He spoke like someone used to tragedies, but even in his tone, there was an edge of helplessness. And in a place like Sundown Haven, that was rare. No one could approach her, not even seasoned handlers. But as Callum turned to discuss next steps, Leona did something that stopped him cold. She sat down. No words, no movement, just sank to the cold floor in front of Naomi's cage and stayed there. Callum blinked. You're not going to? No, Leona murmured. Not yet. There was no protocol for what she was doing. No training manual to explain it. But instincts, those subtle whispers honed through years of working with the abandoned, the abused, the barely hanging on, told her to stay exactly where she was. For hours, she remained cross-legged on the floor, hands resting gently in her lap. Nayomi didn't budge, didn't look up, but she didn't bolt either. That was enough. Leona knew the first step wasn't contact. It was trust, and trust had to be earned. She had seen it before, in fractured animals and wounded people alike. Fear didn't retreat with force, it only burrowed deeper. She once worked with a shelter dog that wouldn't go near anyone for months. Not until a teenage volunteer started sitting beside his kennel every afternoon with a comic book and a bag of cheese puffs. No words, no coaxing, just presence. By the second week, the dog would creep closer, nose twitching at the smell of snacks. And by the third, he was laying his chin on the boy's lap. Presence was its own kind of language. And so Leona sat. The concrete beneath her chilled her legs, and her back ached from the posture, but she didn't move. Occasionally, she shifted her breathing or blinked slowly, signaling to Nayomi that she was no threat. The subtle, primal signs of peace, slowness, softness, silence. She watched Nayomi through the bars, not in study, but in stillness. The leopard's breath was rapid and shallow. Her ribs fluttered like wind-ruffled leaves. It reminded Leona of a little girl she once met during a community outreach event, who flinched at every sound, clutched a tattered stuffed rabbit like a shield. The girl had said nothing all day until someone gently offered her a cookie and simply sat beside her. 10 minutes later, she whispered her name. Every creature, human or otherwise, needs to believe the world can be safe again. And Leona hoped that, in some small way, her stillness would speak volumes. That her refusal to breach Naomi's space would say, I see you. You're not alone. But you decide when it's safe to come back to the world. The hours stretched, the sun creeping across the high windows. Callum passed by once, carrying a clipboard, his expression unreadable. Other staff whispered as they walked past. One volunteer tried to offer Leona coffee. She shook her head gently, never taking her eyes off the silent, trembling shape in the corner. The world outside that wing continued on. Calls were answered, animals were fed, tours came and went, but within that dim hallway, time felt suspended. Leona wondered what Naomi dreamed about. If she dreamed at all, could her mind still remember tall grasses brushing her flanks, warm breezes ruffling her fur, the bright scent of a morning kill? Or had all of it been stolen, replaced by nothing but the cold echo of metal bars and the searing pain of whips? Sometimes trauma doesn't erase memory, it replaces it. She thought of all the ways fear shapes the body, how it makes the spine curl, the eyes dart, the heart race. Naomi embodied every one of them, and yet she hadn't fled. That alone was its own revolution. Leona allowed herself to breathe a little deeper, to rest her hands palms up in her lap. A gesture as old as time, an offering, not of food, not of affection, just of presence. And presence, she knew, was the most honest thing she could give. Time passed. The shelter bustled. Dogs barked, parrots squawked, staff bustled in and out. But Leona didn't move. Her entire world had narrowed to the trembling shape in the corner of that cage. It wasn't until the third hour that Leona noticed it. Naomi's ears weren't flat against her skull anymore. They twitched, subtly, cautiously. She was aware of Leona's presence. Progress. Each noise from another enclosure still made Naomi flinch. Her trembling would spike, her eyes would shut tight. But she didn't flee from Leona. And that small defiance of instinct meant everything. Leona took a slow breath. She reached into her coat and pulled out a single, cooked piece of venison. The scent wafted into the air, rich and warm. Naomi's nose twitched. With calm, practiced movements, Leona placed the meat 2 feet from the bars, close enough to tempt, but far enough to offer space. Then she waited. Minutes passed, then more. And then, a shift. One paw, just one, slid forward. Leona froze, barely daring to breathe. Another inch. And then their eyes met. For the first time, Naomi looked at her. A flash of something flickered in those wild green-gold eyes. A question. A whisper. Can I trust you? Leona didn't speak, didn't move. She just stayed, still and present. Naomi took one more hesitant step, snatched the meat, and bolted back to her corner. Tears stung Leona's eyes. That tiny step wasn't survival. It was choice. And choice meant everything. Choice was agency. And agency, for a creature who had spent her life inside a cage, was a revolution in itself. The next morning, she arrived before dawn. The sanctuary was still cloaked in darkness, dew glistening on the windows. She rounded the corner and froze. Naomi was watching her. No growl, no cower, just awareness. Leona sank to the ground again, her usual position. This time, Naomi didn't even flinch. Leona offered another piece of meat, this time placing it a foot closer. Naomi stepped forward, faster than the day before. Not by much, but it was faster. And when she took the meat, her retreat was slower. Thoughtful. Leona turned her palm upward. An invitation. Naomi hesitated, the tension in her body pulsing like a wire stretched tight. Then, incredibly, she stepped forward, just enough that her whiskers brushed Leona's fingers. The contact lasted only a second, but it was enough to crack the dam wide open. The days that followed stitched together a rhythm neither of them had expected. Each morning brought a little less trembling, a little more stillness. Naomi no longer curled herself into corners, no longer turned her eyes from the light. Sometimes she stood when Leona entered, her tail low but not tucked, her breath steady rather than gasping. They were building something, slowly, wordlessly, a fragile bridge across a chasm of hurt. Trust, Leona had learned, was never earned in grand gestures. It came in inches, in eye contact that lasted a second longer, in flinches that became pauses, in the weight of silence that no longer felt like fear, but rather like listening. She remembered a quote pinned to the sanctuary's staff room bulletin board, slightly water-stained and faded from sun. You cannot rush a flower to bloom by shouting at it. Nayomi was blooming. Each day brought more progress. The trembling eased. Her ears no longer flattened. She approached the food without hesitation, and soon, Nayomi wasn't just tolerating Leona. She was seeking her out. Leona began to notice subtler signs. Naomi's breathing slowing when she sat down, her eyes no longer darting to corners, her tail flicking not in panic but in faint curiosity. She started to pace near the bars, not in circles of anxiety, but as though testing invisible limits. Exploring. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the high windows and dappled the concrete floor in golden patches, Nayomi let out a sound. It wasn't a growl or a hiss. It was a soft chuff, barely audible. To an untrained ear, it might have sounded like a sigh. But Leona knew better. It was a greeting. Somewhere, deep in Naomi's memory, the sound must have lived dormant and used for years. A natural sound, instinctual, social, vulnerable. And now, here it was again. A doorway. And one morning, she did something that stunned every staff member watching. Leona opened the enclosure door. Slowly, gently. Nayomi didn't flee. She stepped forward, paused, and then pressed her head into Leona's chest. Leona could barely breathe. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever known. Naomi's weight was solid against her, her muscles still taut beneath the silky fur. Her breath was warm. Her head, once kept tucked away in the shadows, now rested freely against a human being. The staff held their breath from the observation deck. One whispered, "She's touching her," in disbelief. But Leona didn't hear them. Her entire awareness was wrapped around the moment, around the living pulse of this creature leaning into her not with force or fear, but with trust. It was the first time Nayomi had ever asked for affection, the first time she had reached for kindness, and she had done it freely. In that moment, Leona felt like she was witnessing something sacred, not just a breakthrough, but a rebirth. She thought of the thousands of years that separated their two species, predator and human, often at odds in the wild. And yet here they were, side by side, joined not by dominance or fear, but mutual vulnerability. Trust, when earned through pain, becomes something diamond-strong. And yet it remains delicate, always requiring nurture, patience, and presence. Like building a fire in damp woods, it takes forever to catch. But once it does, it warms everything around it. As Nayomi leaned into her, Leona thought of all the times she had felt small and unsure in her own life. The heartbreaks, the loneliness, the nights she had sat in silence, wondering if anyone could truly see her. And she realized this wasn't just about saving Nayomi. This was about both of them remembering that healing was possible. Over the next few weeks, Nayomi blossomed. She no longer shied from human presence. She accepted food directly from Leona's hand. She let other caretakers near, cautiously, yes, but no longer with panic. But Leona knew the truth. Nayomi didn't belong in a cage, even one filled with love. She was born for the wild, Leona said at a staff meeting. We didn't save her to keep her locked up again. Some worried. What if Nayomi had forgotten how to hunt? What if humans had changed her too much? Leona didn't flinch. Then we help her remember. The room fell quiet after her words. Someone scribbled nervously on a clipboard. Another sipped coffee with hesitation. The idea of releasing an animal so deeply scarred felt reckless to some, idealistic to others. But to Leona, it was simply right. That night, she sat beside Naomi's enclosure under a canopy of stars. The air was cool, the quiet broken only by the soft rustling of wind-blown leaves and the distant yowl of a lynx. She watched the leopard stretch out on the straw-lined floor, her frame no longer coiled in tension, but beginning to embody something else: readiness. It struck Leona how much rewilding a creature mirrored healing a person. The trauma may never vanish, but the wild within doesn't disappear. It waits, dormant, buried, sometimes almost silent, but it waits. In ancient myths, animals often symbolized aspects of the human psyche: the lion as courage, the owl as wisdom, the snake as transformation. But the leopard, silent, precise, solitary, had always embodied mystery, power, and patience. Nayomi was all of those things, and now she was learning to be herself again. Sundown Haven approved the plan. Nayomi would be released into Kavanga Reserve, a remote, untouched region rich with natural prey and minimal human contact. A GPS collar would monitor her progress. For a month, Leona worked with Nayomi daily. Food wasn't offered, it was hidden. Prey dummies were placed in trees. Trails of scent were laid. Leona restructured Naomi's days around challenge and instinct. No more direct handouts. No more easy options. At first, Nayomi stumbled. She pawed at branches instead of climbing. She sniffed the air but didn't follow it. She circled instead of pouncing. But then her instincts ignited. Her muscles tensed. Her eyes sharpened. She began stalking with the grace of her ancestors. There was a moment, a defining one, when she caught her first moving target, a rolling lure dressed in rabbit fur that mimicked erratic prey. Leona watched from a distance, barely daring to exhale. Naomi's crouch was low, calculated. She didn't hesitate. Her body lunged forward in a blur of power and precision. When her paws closed around the target, Leona knew. She remembered. As the rewilding training progressed, other small victories followed. Nayomi stopped glancing back at people during her simulated hunts. She began sleeping at the highest point in her enclosure, alert, ears swiveling. Once, Leona saw her pacing just before dusk, eyes scanning the trees, like a sentinel of her own choosing. Each day, Leona made her routines more complex. Scent trails were doubled back, prey dummies elevated higher. She introduced recordings of forest sounds, birds, insects, distant baboons, to prepare Nayomi for the sensory complexity of Kavanga. Rewilding was not just physical, it was cognitive, emotional, spiritual even. In a way, Leona often thought, it mirrored the process of leaving behind grief. You start out frozen, then you move tentatively, then, one day, you run. And finally, release day came. Inside the transport cage, Nayomi was calm. Her eyes met Leona's, steady and unafraid. Leona hadn't slept the night before. She'd spent it reviewing every detail, every GPS calibration, every release protocol, every emergency scenario. But now, sitting beside the cage in the early morning haze, all that faded. The only thing she could focus on was the stillness between them, a quiet understanding. The journey to Kavanga was long. The landscape unfolded into vast golden plains. Baobabs rose like ancient sentinels. Herds of gazelle moved through the grass like a whisper. Every mile felt like a shedding of old layers. Layers of captivity, fear, and trauma. They were headed somewhere older than memory. When the team arrived, the sun was cresting the horizon, casting warm amber light across the savanna. The team positioned the cage at the edge of a dense tree line. Acacia branches framed the clearing, dancing in the wind like welcoming arms. Leona knelt beside it. Nayomi looked at her one last time. There were no words, but there was understanding. Leona opened the door. Nayomi stepped out. She didn't run. She didn't cower. She walked, head high, body poised. Then, after one last look, she turned and sprinted into the wild. Leona stayed there for a long time after Nayomi disappeared from sight. The grasses waved gently, the horizon quiet in its vastness. One of the field biologists beside her whispered, "She's gone." But Leona shook her head. "No, she's home." There's a moment after letting go of something you love where your heart feels weightless and hollow all at once. It's grief and joy braided together. That's what Leona felt. It wasn't just Nayomi leaving. It was the closing of a chapter, one written in fear and rewritten in trust. 6 months later, Leona sat in her small office at Sundown Haven. tracking Naomi's GPS signal. The data was clear. Naomi had adapted. She had claimed territory. She had begun hunting successfully. And recently, her movements had changed. They had slowed, repeated the same short pattern, the pattern of a mother. Naomi had cubs. She hadn't just found freedom, she had found a future. Leona pressed a hand to the screen, smiling through tears. The leopard who had once trembled in the dark now walked proudly under the sun. And somewhere out there, in the rustle of Kavanga's grass, a new generation thrived, because one soul had learned that not all hands bring pain. Sometimes, all it takes is patience and love. If Naomi's story moved you, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with fellow animal lovers, and subscribe for more real-life rescue journeys that remind us of the resilience within all living beings. Every like, share, and comment helps bring more visibility to stories like hers and the sanctuaries that make healing possible. Tell us in the comments, what moment in Naomi's journey touched your heart the most? Was it her first step toward Leona, her walk into the wild, or the discovery that she had become a mother? We'd love to hear your reflections.